From an episode based on the American president's doomsday briefcase to a super serious one addressing the very real issue of human trafficking. These are the stories of the NCIS franchise that were based on real life. The best part to start is at the beginning of the series itself. Yankee White was the very first episode of NCIS. The episode centers on the mysterious death of a Navy commander aboard Air Force One. Not just any old military officer, but the one carrying the football. The involvement of the football is a source of tension in the episode, serving to distract the authorities from the real plot to assassinate the president. You can't blame them for taking this death so seriously, because football is a serious business. It's based on the actual nuclear football that is present around the POTUS at all times. Clearly, the nuclear football isn't an actual football, it's a briefcase. The White House Military Office's former director, Bill Gully, described the contents of this briefcase, which includes a black book containing options for retaliating against a first strike, a list of classified nuclear launching silos, a brief manual on the emergency alert system, and finally, a card with authentication codes. The idea is that the president should always be able to give the order to annihilate the world with nukes, which totally reflects football's Cold War origin. Despite this being a highly sensitive object, it's been put at risk a number of times in the past. Most famously, President Reagan almost lost the card with the launch codes during the attempt on his life, and an aide with the football was stuck in the Capitol during the January 6th riots. But that's not the only example from the show's early days, as Ari Haswari is a sad reflection of reality too. Introduced in the first season of the show, Ari was its earliest recurring villain. He really made his splash in the second season finale though, killing Special Agent Kate Todd. The third season opened with a two-part episode that brought Haswari's story to a close. Ari's backstory is pretty tragic. The son of a Palestinian mom and an Israeli dad, he followed in their footsteps and became a doctor. While working as a doctor in the Gaza Strip, an Israeli bombing strike kills his mother. And in grief, Ari becomes a radical Islamic terrorist. As experts have been warning us since the beginning of the war on terror, the more civilians that are killed in the Middle East, the more recruits are going to join up with terrorist organizations. The chaos in Iraq and Afghanistan fueled membership in Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And as recently as a few years ago, the civil war in Syria sent disillusioned young men to ISIS. Organizations like the NCIS are often called on to bust terror plots in the US, and sometimes the price of that work can be heavy. In a way, the fact that the show's first big villain was a terrorist also reflects the post-9/11 environment in which the show was created. I'll give them credit for handling the subject with a lot of sensitivity, more than you might expect. And let's go back to Iraq for the next episode. The season 5 episode Requiem tackles yet another controversy for the Iraq War. It begins with Maddie Tyler, the daughter of Gibbs' old buddy, asking for help with her ex-boyfriend Rudy Haas, a Marine who she thinks is stalking her. After Gibbs tries to confront him off the books, Haas appears to abduct Maddie and take her to an abandoned warehouse. But it turns out that someone killed him before Maddie was kidnapped. We learn that Haas was involved in a scheme to steal $4 million of aid money during the war in Iraq. Because the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan were such logistical nightmares, a lot of money sent as aid was misappropriated. Through corporate corruption and outright theft, the people in those countries would often not see the money that was meant to help them. In fact, around the time the episode came out, a soldier had been pocketing aid money in Iraq, and he was only caught when the small-town hero bought himself a Hummer and a BMW. The guy was a civil affairs officer in charge of overseeing funds bound for reconstruction projects, and he'd pocketed over $690,000 under the table. At least they got the money back in this case. While the NCIS crew had to give up the money to save Maddie, we spent a lot of time in the show's early days, but NCIS still pulls from the real world even now. The show has explored domestic terrorism in some of its recent seasons. You'd be hard-pressed to find a bigger example of that than the show's 9th season finale, which culminates in the bombing of the NCIS headquarters itself. The guy behind the plot of the episode is Harper Deering, a man with an axe to grind with the Navy. His son was killed in a terrorist attack on the ship where he was stationed, which happened to have a manufacturing defect that the terrorists exploited. This storyline definitely has echoes of the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, in which Timothy McVeigh destroyed most of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. McVeigh was disillusioned with the American government as a whole, and he was looking to avenge the victims of the Waco siege and the Ruby Ridge incidents. He was also angry about American foreign policy. He, like Gibbs, was a Gulf War veteran. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Building was one of the most shocking terrorist attacks America had ever seen at the time. If you're too young to remember it, you could almost think of it as 9/11 before 9/11. While an incident like this has never happened again, the sentiments that inspired it run strong in certain corners of the country to this day. I hope that wasn't grim enough for you, because the show does take it up a notch. Up next is an episode about human trafficking, aptly titled Gone. The 8th episode of Season 10 opens with the murder of a naval officer and the attempted kidnapping of his daughter Lydia and her friend Rosie. While Lydia manages to get away, Rosie is spirited away. And it's up to NCIS to solve the case. Reflecting the theme of exploring the exploitation of children, the team first suspects a registered sex offender who's been stalking Rosie. That guy was guilty of a lot of messed up things, but kidnapping Rosie wasn't one of them. Eventually, NCIS manages to catch the kidnappers, but we aren't done with the horror yet. It turns out that one of the culprits was a friend of the girls' families, and he'd helped the kidnappers out in exchange for $500,000. Once again, the show went down roads that you'd never expect a network series to go down. But these are the kinds of threats that exist in our world today. And what are crime shows, if not a way to engage with those threats from the comfort of your living room? If you're feeling queasy about the subjects of these episodes, hang in there a little longer. We're almost done here. The last episode for today is Daughters, the finale of the show's 16th season. This episode sees NCIS tackle another one of America's bugbears, drugs.
Hi, Uncle Gibbs.
I am. Feeling better?
Fine, actually.
Tori's is on it.
We can forget about that, too. You're gonna be okay. That's what's important.
Former FBI agent and friend of the group, Tobias, makes a special request to Gibbs, asking him to investigate the drug-dealing operation that sold his daughter Emily opiates. With Emily hospitalized with an overdose, this case touches a nerve for Gibbs, and it probably touched a nerve for a lot of Americans watching at home. The episode is definitely inspired by the opioid epidemic in the U.S., with many of that epidemic's victims being people suffering from mental health crises. Emily's story in the show has a lot to do with her grief over the murder of her mother, and being a young girl, she's more vulnerable to the temptations of drug use. Fans of the show will know that although Emily makes it through this episode, her story ends in tragedy, and she passes from a drug overdose 2 seasons later. As heartbreaking as that was on TV, unfortunately, this is how most opiate addiction stories end. This might just be one of the heaviest topics that NCIS has covered, and it's impressive that a show striving for the biggest audience possible went in such a bold direction. That's all I have on NCIS cases based on true events.